It's been 5 years since I last shared my picks for the top comic book movies. In that time, we've gotten Infinity War, Endgame, Zack Snyder's Justice League, Into the Spider-Verse, No Way Home, and many, many more. And hopefully I've gotten a little bit better at this. So today I'm sharing my 30 favorite comic book movies of all time. Hey patrons, you are getting an extended version of today's video with 10 more of my favorite comic book movies of all time. This is a favorites list. It's not objectively my picks for the best comic book movies of all time. I started by pulling from all of my different rankings that I've done about these movies before and merging it together, and that gave me my first draft, but then I kind of went, no, this is a favorites list, and so what are the ones that just mean the most to me? If I'm on an island, which movies do I want to take with me? It's kind of a little bit different from my other rankings. That's why you'll see some pretty big discrepancies. And let's get started. Number 30, Time Cop. I love 90s martial arts action films. I love Jean-Claude Van Damme films, and I love time travel movies. And this film merges them all together. Now, a lot of people don't realize this is based off of a comic book, so most people don't include it in their top list because it's Time Cop, and it's not what normally people think of as a great comic book movie, but this is absolutely my kind of thing. Just a bunch of things I love merged together. If you're not super familiar with kind of Jean-Claude Van Damme's career, he started off with like more straightforward, like low budget tournament martial arts films. And then as he kind of grew in fame, he kind of moved into doing these kind of more mid-budget action thrillers. And this was kind of the peak of his career where he did a big, slick time travel action film. And it was his highest grossing film that he ever made. So if you're kind of looking to dive into Jean-Claude Van Damme's filmography, this is one to check out for his like blockbusters, and then check out Bloodsport for his kind of mid-budget stuff, but just a lot of stuff that I enjoy. It's cheesy, it's so 90s, it's totally my thing. Number 29, Joker. And when I mentioned before, there's some kind of discrepancies between some of my past rankings, like my ranking of all 45 DC films versus this list. This is one that I'm immediately talking about. It's a great film. I gave it a great review. It's in my top 10 of the year that it came out. And it's one of my favorite comic book movies of all time, but it's kind of a newer film. It's one that like I haven't like rewatched a bunch of times. I watched it in the theater and then I watched it for my ranking. And so it's a movie that like I can be like, oh, that was awesome. I loved what they did with that. But is it one that I immediately go to? No, it's not. What I love about it is that it doesn't do any of the normal comic book movie stuff. It is a character study. It's a tragedy. Our lead character is not the hero. He's very much the villain, and it's a villain origin story. We're rooting for him, but we also know if he finds his confidence, that means he turns into this monster. And we don't want that for him. And so it's just real complicated emotions towards our lead character. It's very obviously inspired by Martin Scorsese films, much more so than any film in the comic book movie genre. That's what makes it special. That's what makes it interesting. And then you have, of course, a phenomenal performance from Joaquin Phoenix. 28, Logan. This is another one like Joker, where if you look at my my Marvel ranking, this one was way up high on the list. It's a fantastic film. Love James Mangold's direction. Love doing this very dark spin on the character. It's a wonderful send-off for one of the iconic castings and characters in the world of comic book movies. It's not one that I just kind of throw on all the time, though. It's not one that kind of has like a special place that I have great memories attached, like distinct memories of the theater experience, anything like that. It's just a great movie. Whereas like some of the ones higher on the list, not as good of movies, but they're just so special to me. They're just like really cool movies that tie into other things in my life. That's what I talk about when there's kind of discrepancies in there of like that personal, totally subjective experience. That's what this list is all about. Why do I love these movies? And kind of what was the memories associated with them? Next up, The Batman, another movie. It was in my top 10 of this last year. It's the Batman movie I've been waiting for such a long time, but it is newer to me, so it doesn't have kind of a special level place quite yet. But I just loved this lived-in version of Gotham, that it felt like everything had a rich history and backstory behind everything that was kind of going on.
I'm vengeance.
Just the way that we get this version of a Batman film, that it's very much Batman in the suit doing detective work throughout the whole film. And while it's very comic booky, it's also heavily inspired by the movie Seven.
This is about a king, and Riddler's the match.
And that's what we've been missing in our Batman movies. Him as the world's greatest detective, not as just like a little sprinkling in, like a montage scene of him doing an investigation, but making that front and center what it's all about in this great Gotham, just populated by interesting, lively characters. I love seeing it. 26, Watchmen. This is Zack Snyder's adaptation of the most celebrated graphic novel of all time that came out during a period in comic book runs where they were trying to make them more mature, more adult. And then you get Watchmen, which is like this deconstruction of the entire genre. It's mature, it's complex, it's political, it's just jam-packed with interesting ideas, characters, backstories, and it's all so fleshed out. And for literally 20 years, it was thought to be unfilmable because of the nature of the way it was designed. And the writer of it, Alan Moore, still would argue it's unfilmable and doesn't want his name attached to the version that was created. But they bring in Zack Snyder, who's just a very visual storyteller with a distinct style, interesting way that he composes things. And he, as about as good of a job as you can do, brings it to life. And it's a little bit tricky because there's like 3 different versions, and one of them is almost like a direct translation of the graphic novel into film form, with even like these little panels of these cartoons and stuff injected into it. There's like this 4-hour-long version, and there's the theatrical version. There's one in the middle that has all of the live action footage, but doesn't necessarily do all kind of the trippy, weird stuff where you have pirate cartoons in the middle of it that fit in the graphic novel, but the graphic novel is written specifically for that format, so it doesn't necessarily actually translate into live action the way they hope. But just like, once again, they're taking some of the best, most interesting, distinct, different material in graphic novel history at a point in time where comic book movies were exploding. This is right after The Dark Knight, right after the start of the MCU, and then you get, at that point in time, this film version of this very different exploration of heroes and what they would be like in the real world, and giving a different perspective on them. And some people loved it, some people hated it, some people hated the Zack Snyderisms thrown into it. I love that it exists. 25, X-Men First Class. When it comes to the First Class set of films, most people praise Days of Future Past as the best. This is the one that's always stood out to me. I didn't like the trailers for it. They didn't in all sell me on the film. I was like, why are we doing a prequel like this? They didn't capture what made the movie interesting and unique. And then you check it out, and Matthew Vaughn just brought in this like 60s, almost like James Bond aesthetic to the world of the X-Men. But then it's also about the actual birth of the friendship between Magneto, Charles Xavier. And so just like it's about friendship, people coming together, but at the same time realizing how their different backgrounds, the events that brought them together are also will set them up to tear them apart. And so I just thought it was such a neat movie with a great aesthetic. It was so much better than it had any business being. Great cast. Like, how many times can you, in the same kind of continuity, I mean, it's the messiest continuity ever, but like perfectly cast these 2 characters for the original run and then perfectly cast them again for the prequel run. So good. I love it. 24, Captain America Civil War. This is another one that probably would have been higher based off just merging together past rankings. And as I've said many, many, many times before, and you've probably heard me say many, many times before, I just love that they found a way to make this movie that's a sequel to Winter Soldier, Age of Ultron, while setting up Black Panther, the breakup of the Avengers, Black Widow. I mean, it just ties together all these different plot lines seamlessly. It is a Captain America story, but it also is kind of Avengers 2.5. And it's criticized heavily for not having enough stakes in the comic run. There was like actual deaths, and here people are like, it doesn't feel like this really mattered. But the rest of Phase 4 made it really clear it really mattered in a major way, because the breakup of the Avengers meant it cleared the path for Thanos to win. I love that years later, we can still argue about who was right. I mean, I put out a video on my second channel, Sean Chandler Plus, about who was right, and 50-50. People on both sides. Team Rogers, Team Stark. And that, like, the sequences in here where you get to have the airport sequence where all of our Avengers are fighting each other. Like, it's just like a dream come true. That if you're old enough to remember pre the first Avengers, in comic movies before that, we just didn't have team up movies like this. In 4 years after the Avengers, they're all like, all of our toys are fighting each other like when we were growing up. It's the whole, we're in the sandbox with all of our toys, mashing them together, except it's actually a big blockbuster movie, and it's awesome. We got that. That's so very, very cool. And, you know, it's lower on the list because it's not a movie that is like distinct, like nostalgic importance to me. Like, I don't really remember when I went to go see it in the theater. It kind of came out at a point in time where there's a lot of cool movies coming out in the MCU, and there's just other ones that kind of have that, like, wow, that was cool. It marks something for me. And this is just a movie that's like, yeah, it's a great MCU film. Then we have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. For me, the really cool thing about this one is I believe it's the first Spider-Man movie that my kids were able to see in the theater. And so we rewatch this one all the time. And even like in Fortnite, they want to get all the skins. They you know, they've added Spider-Gwen in, and I don't think they have Miles yet, but like they're waiting, like, when are they going to add Riders? I guess we'll add Miles whenever Across the Spider-Verse comes out. Like, we actually talk about that so that we can have like the whole Spider-Verse, main Spider-Verse team for a Fortnite battle as a family. And that's really fun and cool. But then even as a movie, it's an interesting and different Spider-Man story. It's a Miles Morales origin story. It's a great, very different Peter Parker story.
How do I know I'm not going to mess it up again? You won't. I hate to leap the faith.
And then just as an animated film, it has a distinct, interesting style. All of this while just being a really good, entertaining movie that does a bunch of trippy, weird, crazy stuff.
Is he in black and white?
Where's that wind coming from? We're in a basement.
Wherever I go, the wind follows.
While feeling right. And just like an awesome thing that gets to exist now. We live in this great era where they can do things this different and actually make it really good. And man, we're at a great time for comic book movies. 22, Man of Steel. This is a movie that every time I watch it, I like it a little bit more. When it first came out, I was actually pretty kind of like torn on it. Like, man, I don't know about that. Like, it's like such a different take. I always liked it. I always enjoyed it. But it was so different from what I expected, so different from the Christopher Reeves movies that I grew up with, that I wasn't sure what to make of it. And then every time I've watched it, be able to accept it more on its own terms, and then as kind of seen more of Zack Snyder's kind of vision for where all of this was going, just gotten more and more out of it. And being able to see a Superman that the special effects finally allow him to do a bunch of really cool stuff. And taking the character and treating him as this kind of complex person torn between different worlds. I just love so much of what they were able to do with this movie. 22, Spider-Man 2. And after the original Spider-Man was able to lay the foundation, do the origin story, this movie's able to just pick up with a Peter Parker struggling to balance it all. His love life, his work life, his school life, and oh yeah, he's Spider-Man. And they find a way to just really make that at the center of the story. Like, give him this arc of the burden that comes with being Spider-Man, which was the natural next step from where they left him at the end of the first film. Adding to that, you get a great villain thrown into the mix, and one of the best action sequences in a comic book movie ever with the train sequence that I love the way that sequence is handled and the way the movie treats New York City as a group, as a character.
It's all right.
We won't tell nobody.
That views Spider-Man as one of their own. I love that. I love that element. And so just so many great little moments in here, so many great beats. And just a fantastic sequel. And a great dashboard confessional song over the credits.
Captivated, I am. Vindicated, I am selfish.
Number 20, Blade. I love comic book movies. I love horror movies. I love martial arts movies. And Blade manages to merge all of those together. It's able to do some fantastic world building that just kind of sucks you into this reality where vampires exist and you have this daywalker, Blade, who's trying to take them all out because they keep killing humans. Everything feels like it has this amazing history to it. And then it has a very distinct style, both visually with the techno music, with the fight choreography that was more inspired by kind of Hong Kong fight choreography than Hollywood fight choreography when that was just starting to be a thing in Hollywood. So it's like ahead of the curve in a bunch of different ways. And it's just a very distinct, interesting, entertaining comic book movie. Number 19, The Rocketeer, a throwback serialized action adventure in the style of the Indiana Jones movies, directed by Joe Johnston, who worked on the Indiana Jones films. And this movie came out when I was the perfect age to just be so excited to get to see this movie where a guy puts a rocket pack on his back and becomes a superhero. Also, it came out the year right before I was about to go to Disney World. So when I went to Disney World as a child, they had an actor dressed up as the Rocketeer on wires and he flew up in the air and I got my picture taken with him. All of that fun stuff. And also for the longest time, I didn't actually know this was based off of a comic book, but it technically is. So this is a movie I just have a ton of nostalgia for. I had the VHS tape growing up, watched it all of the time. And when I rewatch this adult, like it really holds up as like a solid adventure. Like sure, like the visual effects of a guy flying with, they're not as good as they would be today, but the movie as a whole,
I like it.
Number 18, 300, Zack Snyder's testosterone-fueled action film that's just oozing with style. From the way that it looks, to the choreography, to the way that it's shot. Everything has a distinct style to it. The story itself, very straightforward. 300 dudes take on 1,000,000 dudes, and it's just done in a way that makes it interesting and compelling. And a big part of that is kind of this just band of brothers vibe where the Spartans have a distinct worldview and code that they live by.
Madness. This is Sparta!
That they are perfectly happy to go and die to protect the people that they love, and to die in battle is a great death for them. And there's just something about that that's compelling and captivating. It's also a movie that's just totally unashamed to be pure machoism on display. It knows what it is and it goes for it. So it delivers a pure experience and one that's distinct and memorable. Next up, Superman 2. This, along with Superman 78 and Batman 89, were the comic book movies that I grew up with from a very young age. I had this one recorded on a VHS tape from when it broadcast on network television, and they actually injected some extra scenes into it. So when I bought an actual VHS tape or got my first DVD, I don't remember which one came first, I was confused because it was missing scenes that I grew up watching in the film off that broadcast version of it. But this movie takes, after the foundation, the origin story has been laid, it kind of ratchets up the threat by bringing in all these Kryptonians, and it becomes the movie that set the template for so many superhero sequels that have come out afterwards. In particular, the idea of the hero being torn between love and their personal life and their responsibility to keep people safe in that role that only they can do. And it's been copied many times before, in particular in Spider-Man 2, but many other films, and it's been implied that's what they're going to do with the second Shazam film. And it's just a great follow-up to the original Superman. But the reason it isn't higher up on the list, because I want to put it higher up on the list, is that we don't have a pure version of the film. We have two incomplete versions. To simplify kind of what went down, the original director, Richard Donner, shot 80% of the movie, then was fired and replaced by someone. And to get director credit, you have to shoot over 50% of the movie. So he reshot that over enough of a percentage of the film so that he could get credit for it. But the guy that did all these reshoots doesn't understand Superman as well as the original director. And so the theatrical version is the slicker version of the film, but there's some very big flaws in the interpretation of Superman and some just corny humor thrown in there. 25 years later, they allowed Richard Donner to complete his version of the film, but he only shot 80% of his movie. So it's like a Frankenstein version of the film that is using test footage and like shoddy CGI and some other tricks to try and complete it. It's just like a Frankenstein version of a better version of the film, but it's a Frankenstein version and you have a slicker version of a flawed version. If we had a pure version of Richard Donner's version, I think it's better than Superman 78. But any way you put it, even with flawed version, it's one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. Number 16, Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Batman the Animated Series is my favorite animated TV show of all time, and this is the feature-length film adaptation of the show that came out during the run of the original show. And it manages to tell a new Batman story with a new villain while bringing in legacy characters like the Joker that are established. It also has a Batman origin story in there. It has a great Bruce Wayne story about the conflict inside of him, of that tension we were just talking about, of his responsibility as the hero while being a person with emotions that has desires to connect with others. It kind of has everything in there in just an hour and 15 minutes. It's a very efficient film, and it's my favorite adaptation of Batman in Batman the Animated Series as a whole that we've ever gotten, and this is our film version of that. Number 15, The Incredibles. Now, technically, this is not a comic book movie, but you know exactly why it's included on this list, and it's my list of favorites, so I can include anything I want in my list of favorites. And this is just a great original superhero story that, while it is reminiscent of several classic comic book characters and tropes, in particular the Fantastic Four, it's also wholly different in what it does with them. And Brad Bird brings in like this 60s spy aesthetic to the film that makes it distinct and interesting the way things play out. He's great with his action and visual, so it's dynamic when those happen. And at its core, it's a family story, but it's about a man having a midlife crisis. It's a very relatable story while telling an incredible story about this superhero family. And so it kind of has a little bit of everything.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
And even as an animated film, it was groundbreaking in some of the things that they did with the film, even like the daughter's hair. They had to invent new technology to be able to have hair that was able to flow like that and have that much detail in hair at this point in time with computer animation. And so a movie that takes a genre that I love, comic book movie characters, and does its own original version of them in a unique way that brings so many new things to the table. Number 14, Spider-Man No Way Home. If you've seen my past coverage of this film, you know as movie critic guy, I have some issues with the setup for the film.
Stop tampering with the spell.
Oh my God, Ned, he's my best friend. Oh, my Aunt May should...
Brilliant, but lazy.
But as Spider-Man movie fan guy, when you think about like what are just amazing theatrical experiences, what are just movies that it's so cool that they exist, that's a thing that we actually got.
That
was awesome.
Obviously, Spider-Man No Way Home comes to mind. And if you were there opening weekend, hopefully you were lucky enough to be in a theater like mine, where when Andrew Garfield took his mask off, walked through that portal, my theater started freaking out, just clapping, shouting, yelling. And I took my kids to go see it, and they've seen the Raimi films. They've seen the Andrew Garfield films, so they understood plot-wise that, like, oh yeah, multiverse. But they're young enough that they don't understand how special it was, what we were experiencing. And so while everyone's cheering and clapping, my son turns to me and goes, "What's going on? Why is everyone cheering?" And it was such a neat experience. And the fact that they were able to pull together these continuities and the marketing didn't spoil it. The marketing didn't ruin it. They trusted us to show up and actually save some surprises for us. The biggest surprise, the biggest selling point that they had for this movie, they didn't spoil it. They didn't use it to market the film. They trusted that people would come to their movie and the word of mouth would be phenomenal. And I just got a phone call. But it worked. It was so satisfying. Despite whatever issues I have with the setup, by the end of the movie, there's such a huge grin on my face. There's so many great pieces of dialogue. There's so many amazing moments. So, of course, in light of that experience, in light of what this is as a Spider-Man movie fan, I love that this thing exists. Oh, this is my wife. I should actually answer this one. Number 13, The Avengers. And that was my wife on the phone. And apparently tonight there might be a hard freeze here in Texas and we might lose power and water. And my wife is at the grocery store so that we can buy some food and water just in case for ourselves and our kids. Oh yeah, we're supposed to be talking about The Avengers. And this is a film that, if you're young, you might not realize just how big of a deal it was that they pulled this film off. Prior to 10 years ago, we'd never had a big team-up movie like this before. In the decades since, we get them all the time. They're like commonplace to have a big superhero team-up movie. This movie changed the game and our expectations for shared universes as well as comic book movies. And honestly, I didn't think the trailers for this movie looked great. I wasn't sure if Joss Whedon was the right guy to do it, even as someone that loved the television that he'd been doing for the previous 15 years. And then I went opening night and it was so good. It was so fun. It was so funny. And the third act just put a huge grin on my face. They pulled it off. They cracked the code of how to kind of pull all of these characters from very different types of franchises and put them in a movie together and feel consistent with what's come before, but have something distinct when you bring them all together. And, the next week I went to go see it like 2 more times, brought a bunch of my friends with me. I was working with teenagers at the time. I was like, hey, let's go see the movie, bought their tickets and everything, and had all these amazing memories. And it changed the trajectory of the MCU. It changed the trajectory of comic book movies, changed the trajectories of movies in general, where even when they did Scoob a few years back, they tried to make it like a shared cinematic universe for the Hanna-Barbera movies because the MCU did something that was so successful. Then we have Deadpool, and this is another movie where if you're younger, you might not realize that this movie was a huge gamble when it came out. It obviously turned out to be a huge hit, and so is its sequel. And so it's just kind of assumed, yeah, Deadpool, big, gigantic franchise. But they were trying to get this movie made for years, and Fox kept telling them no, they weren't going to let them make it rated R. And they did this test reel that they actually leaked to the internet. And no one will admit that they were the person that leaked it to the internet, but it's a sequence that's essentially in the movie, and people loved it. It was incredibly well received, and Fox went, all right, okay, we'll let you make the movie. They actually gave him a really tight budget, but because the director came from visual effects and had a bunch of connections, they were able to make kind of a bigger movie than the budget normally would have allowed. And the rest is history, that it became one of the most successful rated R films of all time, most successful film in the X-Men franchise, and then the sequel, another gigantic hit. But at the core of why that happened is that they made a really funny movie that had cool action and a great pairing of an actor with a character that just fit perfectly together. And it was something different in a comic book genre that was starting to be oversaturated with kind of the same types of comic book movies. And all of a sudden you get this R-rated, irreverent superhero movie that's meta. It's making fun of the franchise that it's in. It's making fun of the movies as a whole. It's having fun with the casting. And it's a movie that just put a grin on your face and was really watchable. Number 11, Guardians of the Galaxy. And this is one of the most pleasant surprises I have ever had in a theater. I remember summer 2012 where they announced this movie at Comic-Con right after Avengers had come out. And I was like, has Kevin Feige lost his mind? You just put out the Avengers, this incredibly successful, accessible film for broad audiences, and you're following it up with Guardians of the Galaxy? Who are these people?
What a bunch of a-holes.
And then the cast that they brought in was a lot of like, these were not big stars at the time for the most part. And then the trailers were like, that was actually really good. And I was like, it popped and had a great musical selection. I was like, I think there might be something to this movie, and went to go see it. I actually took my interns that I had opening night to go see it. We were about to go on a week-long trip to the Navajo Nation. So before we were going on this work-intensive trip, took them to go see this film and just absolutely fell in love with the characters. Just remember the first time where Star-Lord goes like this and Drax goes, "Why would I put my finger to my neck?" And I went, wait, is that what this character is going to be like? Is that who he is? And they didn't put any of that in the marketing. And I just fell in love with it. And the whole next week was like quoting the movie to my interns the whole time. And I'm going to try and see if I can actually get that group of interns together to go see the third one when it comes out in May. We might be able to pull that one off. Anyway, back to the movie. It just immediately made me fall in love with this group of characters. And James Gunn just makes such personal films that, he takes this weird set of characters and they're so extreme and odd, but so human in another way. There's something about them that you can connect with. And then he does these playlists that just, you can tell he has a deep knowledge of music, and even built into it, like it's an actual mixtape is built into the concept of the soundtrack for the movie. It's an actual mixtape in the way that mixtapes work back in the day, where some of the songs, Jackson 5 and other ones are kind of a little bit more obscure, but they fit perfectly together with the story being told and as just a mixtape that you can listen to afterwards. And that's just the brilliance of James Gunn. And so this was just such a special film, such a great memory that took characters I wasn't really familiar with, didn't really care about, that I was cynical about when I first heard about them, and instantly made me love them. Kicking off our top 10, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1990. And like so many of you, I grew up watching the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, though we might have grown up watching different Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle cartoons. And I was the perfect age to be so excited to go watch this movie, to see it with my mother, think it was awesome, and have my mother be kind of concerned about the violent content in the film. So she was probably one of those people that complained that led to the second movie having drastically reduced violent content, where Michelangelo is fighting with sausages and things like that. Anyway, back to the movie. I loved this one back in the 90s. I had the VHS tape, watched it all of the time. And when I rewatched it as an adult, I realized this is actually like a really good Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie that's structured nicely, has surprisingly good fights in it considering it's dudes in rubber suits. Casey Jones is actually just as cool as I remember him being when I was 7 years old and first watched this movie, or 8 years old when I first watched this movie. And in fact, I went out and bought the NECA replica of his mask and went as Casey Jones for Halloween a year ago, which was quite a bit of fun. But I just think this is actually a really good adaptation of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that kind of combines kind of the darkness of the comics with a little bit of the lightheartedness of the animated show. It kind of has its own distinct vibe and tone to it. It has some emotion, so I just think it's really good. Number 9, Iron Man, the movie that kicked off the MCU and really changed blockbusters forever. And if you've grown up in the MCU era, if you're kind of younger, you may not realize this, but Iron Man was not an A-list character when this movie came out. Like my wife, who, she watched X-Men, the animated series back in the 90s. She was just kind of the average movie viewer, general knowledge of comic book movies, had no clue who Iron Man was when the trailer first dropped for this movie. She just went, oh, that looks like a cool movie about a guy in a robot suit. It was like, that's based off a Marvel character, right? She's like, no, I had no idea Iron Man was a Marvel character. But the trailer itself looked really good, and went to go see it, and it delivered on the promise of the trailer. And it's one of those movies that you just get the perfect actor to play the right character at the right time, with also an incredible story behind the scenes where Robert Downey Jr., when I was young, was kind of this up-and-coming actor that was in a bunch of different things that I saw a couple of them in a couple other movies. And then he just shipwrecked his entire career with a drug problem. And he'd been written off. No one wanted to cast him. And Jon Favreau took a chance on him. And obviously the rest is history. And it's just a really neat story. But the movie itself is also really good. And it feels quaint by comparison to what MCU movies have kind of turned into with just this grand scope. But that's actually exactly what I think makes it special, distinct, and interesting. It's just about a man has a classic hero's journey where he literally goes into a cave for a while and comes out a different person. And this movie gets better in light of the rest of the MCU, and in particular Endgame, where all these lines of dialogue have new meaning and new resonance.
You're gonna kill yourself, Tony. I'm not gonna be a part of it.
I shouldn't be alive, unless it was for a reason. I just finally know what I have to do.
In light of what they were able to do with the character. And so just a movie that did so much. And then you're watching it, the credits roll, and then Nick Fury shows up. As Samuel L. Jackson shows up as Nick Fury, which in the Ultimates comic run, they designed Nick Fury to look like Samuel L. Jackson. Back prior to the Ultimates comic run, Nick Fury looked like David Hasselhoff, who also played Nick Fury back in the 90s, and they redesigned him. And so he walked out, and they hadn't announced that. It was an actual surprise, and he says, hey, we're working on this Avengers initiative. It's like, wait, are they actually doing that? And they did, and it was awesome. Number 8, Batman Begins. And Batman is one of my 2 favorite comic book characters, along with Superman. And I love origin stories, and this kind of gave us the concise, definitive Batman origin story where Batman begins. Kind of a stupid title, but with time, it works. And Christopher Nolan was one of those directors that started to emerge right as I was getting into movies. So his first wide release film, and it wasn't even that wide release, it was actually limited release, was Memento. And it came out right as I was discovering that there's movies that are cool, that are good, that aren't blockbusters where buildings explode and things like that. And I went to go see Memento when it was in very limited release at the Art House Theater in Austin, Texas. Like, oh, it's a movie that like plays backwards. This is awesome. I love this. And so I was kind of an early adopter of Christopher Nolan. He was one of those directors that really shaped me as a person that loves films. And some of my friends, I was like, you got to go see Memento. And they've told me the same thing. Like, you introduced me to Memento, that made me fall in love with movies. And then a few years later, they said that guy was going to do Batman. And like, so this cool director that was so pivotal in my journey, was an up and comer. He's going to do Batman, my favorite comic movie character. This is awesome. I love this. And it turned out to be as good as I'd hoped.
I'm Batman.
The cast is phenomenal across the board, where Christian Bale had been acting in movies for 20 years at that point in time, but he wasn't like an A-list leading man. And he was actually in this movie called Equilibrium just a couple years before this came out. And I saw that and I didn't love the movie, but I was like, oh, this guy can pull off Batman. All right, this is going to be awesome. And then you have all these legacy actors in there as well. There's just a phenomenal cast top to bottom. Love origin stories. So many awesome things.
He fights for family and lives for love.
I never stopped thinking about you.
And for me, this is the most rewatchable Batman movie that we have. Number 7, Zack Snyder's Justice League. And this is one of these films that I never thought that we would see this complete of a version of the film, and certainly not this close to the release of the theatrical cut of the movie. For years, I was saying, yeah, some version that's incomplete of this movie exists, which is true, but we're not going to see any sort of release of it for a decade or 15 years or something like that. And then because there was enough of a fan uprising and just kind of the way the universe played out with kind of COVID, creating a scenario where there was a stop in production of movies, and therefore there's a window of time where the effects artists didn't have work. Therefore, they had a movie that was shot, audience demanding its existence, and the perfect storm of things happened to where Warner Brothers actually went, all right, Zach, here's $70 million to complete your film, which is insane that that's a thing that actually happened. And even up to the point in time where I went in to watch it, I put out videos saying, you know, I'm expecting to be kind of like Batman v Superman, a movie that it's much better, or Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition, a much better version of what we got before, a more complete version, a unified vision, but still a deeply flawed film that probably, you know, has its own issues. And then I watched it and I saw it, you know, got press access. So I got to see it a few days early, and I watched it with my wife, who was not interested in watching it at all. And it was 4 hours long. So I watched it like 2 a.m. or something like that. And at the end of it, my wife, who did not want to watch it, goes, that was actually really good. That was so much better than I was expecting. I was like, okay, like I was thinking maybe like I just was going crazy there, but I like love that. It was like everything that I hoped it could possibly be, but never thought it would actually be as good as it actually was.
You did. You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
And once again, it's such a unified vision of a director that had something he wanted to do with these characters, a big journey he wanted to take them on, that because it was released on streaming, it had none of the restrictions a film would normally have. And you would never release a 4-hour cut of the movie in theaters. You'd get, you know, the 2-hour and 45-minute version or whatever. But we got this version. Maybe some people call it bloated. Some people call it too long. I'm not going to try and convince you otherwise. I get it. But I love the fact that we got this version that's just his pure version of what he wanted to put out, where he could put everything in there. And because of that, it's able to take its time building out this epic story and fleshing out the character arcs, so everything pays off so well. Everything feels earned.
I don't care how many demons he's fought and how many hells. He's never fought us. Not us united.
As an audience member, when certain moments are happening, you're able to piece it together and feel so much when you get to these moments. So it's incredible that this thing ever exists, that we got it, that it was able to happen. Studios don't do this. They don't go, yeah, we screwed up by putting out this other one. Here's $70 million to complete your movie that we screwed up. Studios don't do that. But they did. And now we have Zack Snyder's Justice League, an awesome comic book movie. Number 6, Unbreakable. Like Incredibles, this is technically not a comic book movie, but it's my list and I get to include whatever I want to include. So we've got Unbreakable in here. This is my favorite M. Night Shyamalan film. And some of that's because I love superhero stories, and this is a superhero story. But beyond that, it's very much a character study. It's about friendship. It's about purpose. It's about wanting to feel like you matter, all told through this superhero mythology that M. Night Shyamalan builds out, where you have this character that just has always felt like something's missing, always felt like he's meant for more, never fully understood why he's here. And throughout this story of becoming, of discovery, he realizes his purpose, and it kind of sparks life back into him. And it's just such a satisfying journey. And if you haven't seen it, I want to go into too much details about kind of how it plays out. It's not a big action movie, so don't go in expecting a bunch of spectacle and that's not what it is. It's very much a character drama that it came out before the comic book movie boom, before the genre really took off. It was ahead of its time. It's a movie that if it had come out 10 years later, it probably would have done much better at the box office because it would be such a counterbalance to all these big action spectacles. But it just has a really clever script in what it does and how it treats its characters and the final reveals of what's kind of going on. It is so satisfying. I just adore this film. Bringing us into the top 5, Avengers Endgame, the culmination of the Infinity Saga, and a movie where they did it. They pulled it off. This movie that was meant to pay off 10 years worth of plot lines, 10 years worth of character development, and they did it. And because there was so much buildup and setup, it's able to get away with so much fan service that feels earned. That you can do it and it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel like it's pandering. They earned all of these moments. But beyond that, it's a movie that has a lot of dramatic weight to it, where picking up where Infinity War it left off, you're seeing how each of our Avengers deal with grief and tragedy. You're seeing the world that they've built for themselves after the apocalypse. And so you see them in all these kind of new lights. And of course, all of it builds up to this big slam bang finale that's, I don't know how you top that as a third act to a movie, because it is the culmination of over a decade's worth of films. And therefore, so many little bits are in there that are so satisfying. So awesome. Single lines of dialogue, and you want to get up and cheer, which people did during my opening night screening of the film. And ultimately, you close out Tony Stark's arc, you close out Steve Rogers' arcs in ways that felt satisfying. They found ways to set them up to get to a place where you're like, yeah, that's the right send-off. They saved the galaxy, and they have a point, like a way that you can just close out their arcs that felt right. And if you've watched my reviews all along the way, I had some issues with this movie, but...
And now, looking back on it, I just remember the good stuff.
Number 4, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. I love origin stories, and Spider-Man has one of the best origin stories because he is like such a relatable kid that ends up having these amazing powers and everything that kind of comes along with the burden of responsibility, because
with great power comes great responsibility.
And because this was the first Spider-Man movie, they didn't have to put a clever spin on it. They didn't have to find a way to be different. They didn't have to like dive into Peter Parker's parents or add a bunch of layers to it. They didn't have to like be subversive in how they tell the story. They could just take some of the best, most iconic comic book material and do a straight translation of it to the big screen And for that reason, I just find this movie to be like very fun, very satisfying. And of course, you got a phenomenal cast in here and performances that are just like so iconic that we love seeing these actors in these parts to the extent that just the concept of Spider-Man No Way Home just made people cheer in the theaters at the idea we got to see them again all those years later. But a big part of why this movie is so special to me is that, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first movie that I saw in the theater after my dad died. And obviously, movies have always been a big part of my life, and I've always loved the escape that they bring. And you take one of the hardest months of my life of, reprocessing my existence and what it will be moving forward, of, losing a parent at 20 years old. And while I'm still processing all of that, my family went off to go see the new Spider-Man movie. And it's from the director of the Evil Dead movies. And by then I was a huge Army of Darkness, huge Evil Dead fan. Oh, he's going to do a Spider-Man movie. And for 2 hours, I didn't need to worry about what the rest of my life would look like. I wasn't processing the loss, this very serious loss that had just taken place. For 2 hours, I just got to escape to this world and have this big adventure and feel a bunch of emotions through the story. And that's what movies can do. That in the hardest times in our life, they can give us a glimmer of hope. They can give us escape. They can put a smile on our face. They can make us feel alive in the good ways. And not that, you need to process the hard things in life, but you also need little escapes and not just wallow in that. And during one of the hardest months of my life, this movie was that for me. Right at the time when I needed that. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was there. Well, that got a little bit heavy, but I think that's a good thing. Movies are an important part of my life, and they always have been. Hence why I do this for a living. And if I'm going to talk about my favorite movies, it has to be personal. It has to be real. But to that point, I want it to be personal and real for you. So join me down below in the comment section. Let me know your favorite comic book movies, the ones that mean the most to you. Join me down below in the comment section. My list, of course, is not the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, a little over a year back, I put out a video with my top 40 favorite movies of all time for my 40th birthday. You can check that out right up here to kind of know not just my favorite comic book movies, but my favorite movies in general. Also remember, there is a companion version of this over on my Patreon page with 10 more of my favorite comic book movies of all time. Join at any level, as little as $2 per month or $21 per year. You can get access to that video as well as hundreds of live streams, hundreds of edited videos. The link is down below in the description if you want to learn more about that. In third place, Avengers Infinity War. And to me, the MCU is something special in cinematic history because they were able to pull off this shared universe with all of these different characters with different tones, very different context, and pull them together in one shared universe. And Infinity War, in my mind, is the best version of all of that, where all of these characters come together, and it's so fun to see them interact.
I'm Peter, by the way.
Doctor Strange.
Oh, you're using your made-up names. I'm Spider-Man, then.
And it has this big, epic story that it's fairly straightforward. It's a MacGuffin story trying to collect the Infinity Stones. Who will win the race to get the Infinity Stones? Straightforward, but because it's straightforward, it's able to deliver a bunch of just big, awesome action sequences. But it's also able to take time to let us know this villain and where he's coming from. And gave us, MCU sometimes has had a villain problem. A lot of them are kind of forgettable. The villains don't get as much time as they sometimes need. And this movie, because all of our heroes are established and we spend a lot of time with them, we don't need to meet our heroes. We get all the fun of them interacting, but we really get to meet the villain. And so it's the movie that kind of pulls it all together so well. And I love the fact that the heroes lost. And there's people like, well, we knew that they were going to win in the end. So what's the big deal? Because the heroes lost. There was huge consequences for that loss. For 5 years, there was the apocalypse. That matters. And it took huge cost to undo all of it. So in my mind, the fact that I knew that they're eventually going to win, I don't care like that. It mattered in the moment. And that was the end of the story. This was the story of who will get the Infinity Stones and win the Infinity War. Our heroes lost. Thanos won. So our next story is, how do we undo all of that 5 years later? So love it. Love what they were able to pull off. It's entertaining. It's emotional. It's big. It's awesome. Our runner-up, The Dark Knight. Here, Christopher Nolan delivers kind of his comic book movie magnum opus, which ever since it's come out has been praised as one of, if not the greatest comic book movie of all time. And obviously, I would agree with that. And he did it by pulling inspiration from The Long Halloween, Batman Year One, Dark Victory, several of these iconic comic book runs, but also pulling from some of the best crime thrillers out there, Heat and these other films kind of like that. And so it doesn't kind of have the intellectual inbreeding that a lot of comic book movies and a lot of blockbusters have, where they just are inspired by other movies in the genre, and so they all kind of start to feel the same because of the inbreeding. No, it feels distinct and different. While it's very Batman-y and you can see the ties back to some of these famous comic book runs, the vibe to it is very distinct in the comic book genre because it was influenced by movies outside of the genre. And along those lines, you get this complex, layered story. You get one of the most iconic villain performances and characterizations we've ever gotten. And it even stands out because it breaks so many of the rules, like even comparing him to Thanos. Thanos has a clear motivation and you understand what's driving him. And so much of what makes Heath Ledger's Joker captivating is that it's pure chaos, that the motivation isn't clear. Why is he doing this? He's just a madman that wants to watch the world burn. And that itself is compelling. It's another one where the process of our hero trying to stop the villain, there's great loss along the way. He has to compromise on some of his values to succeed. He loses in certain ways in order to win. And that's where you have a complex story that's layered. It's not simple. It's not clean and black and white. Our hero is not a white knight. He has to be a dark knight. And that's what kind of makes Christopher Nolan's movies awesome. Incredible. Why I love them is that they have all these different elements and layers to it. But coming in at number one is Superman 78. Growing up, I had Superman, Superman 2, and Batman 89. But in particular, Superman 1 and 2, those are the ones that I'd recorded off television. So my entire life, those were just always there. Growing up, I had the Superman shirt and I'd be wearing my cowboy boots as kind of a new fashion look for Superman. And this is the movie that started the comic book movie genre as we know it. Now, Batman 66 had its movie in the 60s, but that was an adaptation of a TV show. It wasn't like a big budget blockbuster the way we think of them. When it comes to Superman the movie, this is the first time someone went, let's get a ton of money and take this material seriously. It's not just for children, it's for everyone. Let's get Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, to write our first draft of the script. Let's get The Godfather himself, Marlon Brando, to be Jor-El, and we'll get Gene Hackman. We'll get all these like top tier talents. We're going to pour a ton of money into it because this is material that by this point in time the movie came out, the kids that grew up reading the original comics, they've grown up and their kids have grown up reading the comics. This is a generational thing. And everyone will go see this if we make it good. And they did. Now, if you didn't grow up watching it, they're campy, they're cheesy, the effects don't hold up because it's almost a 50-year-old movie at this point in time. But it was groundbreaking when it came out. It was incredible. The score from John Williams is still one of the best of all time. The fact that it 45 years ago, they treated the character with such reverence in the way that it does the first 45 minutes of the movie. Just remarkable stuff. And, you know, Kevin Feige said every time they make a Marvel movie, they make everyone go back and rewatch this movie. It's the one that started it all, that influenced it all, that laid the foundation for how you do these things right. And it's the one that shaped me. From before I have memories, I was watching this movie and falling in love with comic book movies. It's the one that led to this moment right now where I'm talking to you. It's that simple. It's the one that I have to have it at number one because it put me on the path that I am on that led to me doing this full time for a living. That, you know, so many of you started watching my videos because of one of my MCU rankings. Well, where does all that go back to? Watching Superman the movie whenever it aired on broadcast television and my parents recorded it on a VHS tape. That led to this moment right now where I'm talking to you. That's really cool. And so this movie's the one that shaped me the most important, so it comes in at number one. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out my video right over there with my top 40 favorite movies of all time. Also remember, there is a version of this video with my top 30 favorite comic book movies of all time. The link for that is down below in the description to check out Patreon to see if it's right for you. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much. Bye-bye.